What if I told you that history's most famous, most aggressive critic of religion didn't actually want to ban it at all?
Yeah, he actually thought the idea of political groups trying to outlaw God by, government decree was completely ridiculous.
Which is wild, right? Because usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
Exactly. But when you step into the world of diagnosing society...
Diagnosing human belief, really.
Right. Diagnosing human suffering and why we believe the things we do, that x-ray machine gets really murky.
It really does. So welcome to another deep dive. Today's mission is navigating a pretty dense, heavy stack of writings by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Specifically, we're focusing on what they had to say about religion.
And it is a diagnostic landscape that requires us to completely shift how we view history. I mean, to really understand their perspective, we have to stop looking at religion as a theological debate about whether God exists or not. And we have to start looking at it as a symptom of a much, much larger societal condition.
And I know exactly why you, the listener, are here with us today. You want to bypass all the dense 19th century academic jargon and just get straight to the aha moments.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
Exactly. The mechanics of one of the most famous and probably most misunderstood critiques in history. Now, before we really get going, I have to say this. Because we are diving into Karl Marx today, which is obviously a highly politically charged topic, we are taking a strictly neutral, purely diagnostic approach here.
Very important point.
Yeah, we are not taking a left-wing stance, we aren't taking a right-wing stance, and we are absolutely not endorsing these views. We are simply acting as your guides, impartially unpacking exactly what is contained in the original source material.
We're just looking at the mechanics of their argument, nothing more.
So what's our roadmap for this?
Well, first we're going to decode that incredibly famous opium of the people quote. Then we'll explore how geography and economics actually shape belief.
Oh, I love that part.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Then we'll examine a massive 16th century peasant rebellion that was completely disguised as a theological dispute. And finally, we'll look at how science began tearing down the mythical veil of society, as they called it.
And how some brilliant scientists totally embarrassed themselves in the process.
Yes, that too. So, to understand those mechanics, we really have to start with the single most famous soundbite Marx ever wrote regarding faith.
The one everyone thinks they know.
Right, the quote everyone knows. Or, well, thinks they know. It's from his 1843 text, Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right.
A very catchy title.
Super catchy. Anyway, Marx writes, religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress.
Okay, so expression and protest.
Exactly. He goes on to say, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people.
The opium of the people. People usually quote that as just like a weapon.
They really do.
They use it to imply Marx thought believers were stupid or just high on some illusion.
Yeah.
But when you read the full context, like you just said, the sigh of the oppressed creature, it actually sounds, I don't know, almost deeply empathetic.
That's exactly it. He is not attacking the believer at all. He's attacking the conditions that make the believer suffer.
So he's looking past the religion itself.
Right. To really grasp this, we have to look at the academic world Marx was arguing with at the time. The dominant philosophical force was this guy, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Hegel basically argued that ideas and human consciousness shape the material world.
Like ideas come first, reality follows.
Exactly. But then came another philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach, who started flipping that entirely. Feuerbach argued that humans actually invent God by projecting their own greatest qualities onto this imaginary infinite being.
So we make God in our image, basically.
Yes. And Marx takes Feuerbach's idea, but he pushes it much, much further. He says, okay, yes, man makes religion, religion does not make man. But the real question is, why does man make it?
And the answer is, because the real world is unbearable.
Precisely. Marx argues that religion is this reversed world consciousness. It's an upside-down way of looking at the world. But it only exists because society itself is reversed and sick.
Sick, meaning the economic system.
Yeah. Religion provides this illusory happiness that people desperately need precisely because real earthly happiness is structurally denied to them by the economic system they live in.
Wait, okay, so when people say Marx hated religion, it's actually more like a doctor diagnosing a symptom?
Right.
Like if a patient is in absolute physical agony from a shattered leg and they take opium just to cope with the
But
pain.
you don't get mad at the opium.
Exactly. You don't scream at the patient for taking a painkiller.
Yeah.
You look at the shattered leg. You try to treat the underlying injury that's causing the agony in the first place.
That analogy gets right to the core of his thesis on Feuerbach. I mean, Marx was incredibly frustrated with other philosophers who just wanted to sit in universities and debate theology in a vacuum.
Just talking in circles.
Right. He wrote that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Oh, that's a great line.
It is. His point is, you cannot cure the patient by stealing their medicine while leaving their leg broken. You have to fix the earthly suffering, the material conditions that force people to need the opium in the first place.
You know, think about the modern coping mechanisms you might use when you're feeling totally crushed by a brutal work week or like financial stress. Maybe it's scrolling endlessly on your phone or binge watching television or retail therapy.
We all have something.
Yeah. And Marx is essentially asking us to look at the systemic conditions requiring that coping mechanism rather than just judging the coping mechanism itself.
Which is a very profound shift in thinking.
It is, but it also leads to a massive question. If Marx believes religion is just a painkiller for a broken society, how exactly does society's physical brokenness invent specific spiritual beliefs? Like, how do we get from a bad economy to a specific type of God?
Okay, that brings us to this huge concept introduced in a text called the German ideology. It's known as historical materialism.
Historical materialism.
Okay.
Lay out for us.
So the defining rule of historical materialism is this. It is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness.
Meaning our physical reality shapes our thoughts.
Exactly. Marx and Engels use this great metaphor of a camera obscura.
Oh, like the early optical device.
Right. It projects an image from the outside world onto a wall inside a dark room, but the image is completely upside down. They argue that morals, philosophy, and religion are that upside-down reflection.
Interesting.
Yeah, they are shadows cast by the real, material, economic life process of human beings.
Okay, so you're saying the shadow on the wall is the religion, but the physical object casting the shadow is the economic system.
That's the argument.
But I want to push on that a little bit. Is it really that simple? Does that mean every single major religious shift in history was actually just an economic shift in disguise? I mean, can you really trace something as deeply personal as theology down to sheer economics?
They argue you can literally trace it down to the dirt we walk on.
The dirt? Okay, you got to explain that.
Let's look at the mechanism. Engels wrote these letters analyzing the history of Oriental cities. He was asking why the East developed such fundamentally different religious and political structures compared to Western Europe.
And what did he find?
He traces it directly back to geography and climate.
Wait, the weather dictated the theology. Walk me through that mechanism.
Okay, so across massive stretches of Asia and the Middle East, you have severe desert climates. You cannot rely on rainfall to grow crops.
Right, so you need irrigation.
You need extensive artificial irrigation systems. Now, a single farmer, or even a small village, they can't build and maintain a massive river diversion project.
No, of course not. That takes huge manpower.
Exactly. It requires a massive centralized authority to organize those public works. Because the state had to monopolize the water and the land to ensure everyone survived, you never saw the rise of private, independent, feudal lords owning huge tracts of land like you did in Europe.
Because the state had to run everything to keep people from starving.
Right. And Engels explicitly calls this absence of private land the key to the Oriental heaven.
The key to the heavens.
Wow. The material reality of the desert forced a centralized economic structure, which in turn cast a shadow. And that shadow was a specific theological and political consciousness centered around a singular, distant, all-powerful authority.
That is wild. So the climate forces the irrigation system.
Yeah.
The irrigation system forces a centralized state, and the centralized state shapes the religion.
That's historical materialism in action.
But what about the West, though? Do they apply this same formula to Europe?
Thoroughly. In Capital Book 1, Marx actually tackles the Protestant Reformation. He asks why Protestantism arose and exploded exactly when it did.
Okay, setting the scene. It's the 1500s.
Right. And the Catholic Church, with its massive, rigid hierarchy of popes, bishops, and priests, perfectly mirrored the rigid, hierarchical feudal system of lords, vassals, and serfs.
Like a mirror image.
But as feudalism started to crack, a new class was rising, the bourgeoisie. the early capitalist middle class of merchants and commodity producers.
And a merchant who wants to trade freely across borders doesn't want a feudal lord standing in his way demanding a cut.
Exactly. Which means they also didn't want a priest standing in their way demanding a cut of their spiritual life.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, Marx argues that a society becoming obsessed with individual commodity production and free markets needed a religion that reflected that exact individualism.
And Protestantism does that.
Right. Protestantism focuses on the abstract man who communicates directly with God, no middleman required.
Wow.
The spiritual individualism of Protestantism was the perfect ideological shadow for the economic individualism of early capitalism.
You know, this is where their framework becomes incredibly potent. Because if you take that idea that religious movements are actually economic rebellions wearing a theological disguise, it completely recontextualizes the massive bloody conflicts of the 16th century.
It really does. We have to remember the reality of the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church didn't just run Sunday services.
No, they were a massive political power.
They owned vast amounts of land, collected massive taxes, and controlled all intellectual and institutional life. If you were a peasant being crushed by taxes and forced labor, you couldn't just write a political manifesto about wealth and equality.
Because no one would read it.
Well, the vocabulary for secular politics didn't really exist for the common person. Any class rebellion absolutely had to wear religious robes.
Which brings us to a specific text, the Peasant War in Germany. This is where Engels analyzes the two biggest figures of the Reformation. You have Martin Luther, the guy who famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door, and then a much more radical figure named Thomas Müntzer.
Right. And the contrast between Luther and Müntzer perfectly illustrates this class war hiding inside the religious war.
How so?
Well, Luther starts out as a fiery radical. His theological rebellion against the Pope is the spark that sets Europe on fire. And the peasants, hearing this language of spiritual liberation, take it literally.
They think he means actual freedom.
Yes. They start a massive armed uprising against their feudal lords to demand economic liberation. But the moment the peasants actually revolt, Luther has to choose a side.
And he doesn't side with the peasants who are literally dying in his name.
He completely abandons them. Luther realizes his reforms need the protection of the wealthy princes and the burghers, the middle-class townspeople.
The people with the money and armies.
Exactly. So Engels details how Luther quickly pivots. He uses the Bible to sanction serfdom and demand total obedience to secular lords. He infamously publishes a pamphlet telling the princes they should stab, knock, strangle the rebellious peasants like mad dogs.
Stab, knock, strangle. It's an incredible betrayal. He just throws the working class under the bus to secure a middle-class religious reform.
That's exactly how Engels frames it. But then you have Thomas Müntzer on the other side of this war.
Who was he?
Müntzer was what Engels calls a plebeian revolutionary. He represented the absolute lowest classes, the peasants, the miners, the urban poor. Müntzer was a preacher who took the language of the Bible and weaponized it into what Engels essentially calls proto-communism in the 1520s.
Hold on, I need to stop you right there. Proto-communism in the 16th century. What did Müntzer actually want?
Well, Müntzer preached that the kingdom of God shouldn't be something you wait for after you die. He wanted to build it on earth immediately.
Okay, a kingdom on earth, what did that look like to him?
His version of the kingdom of God meant a society with no class differences, no private property, and no state authority alien to the members of society.
Wow, that is radically ahead of its time.
He told the peasants that they held the power of the sword and that it was their divine duty to strike down the corrupt, wealthy elites who were hoarding God's creation.
See, hold on, I really have to challenge this.
Yeah.
Was Müntzer actually a true believer in his own apocalyptic theology? Or was he just like a cynical medieval politician? Because it sounds a lot like he was just using religion as a brilliant PR strategy to get uneducated peasants fired up to fight his political war.
That is a very modern way of looking at it, but Engels actually rejects that cynical view.
Really?
Engels clarifies that in the 16th century, radical political ideas could only be conceptualized in theological terms. Müntzer wasn't faking his faith.
So he genuinely believed it.
Absolutely. His language, his visions, his apocalyptic urgency, that was the only vocabulary available to his mind to articulate a radical overhaul of society.
Yeah.
He genuinely experienced economic injustice as a theological abomination.
Because in his mind, hoarding wealth wasn't just bad economics, it was a literal insult to God.
Exactly. The shadow and the object were completely inseparably fused in the minds of the people fighting that war.
Okay, so in the Middle Ages, economics and politics are entirely locked inside these religious robes.
Yeah.
But history keeps moving, right? Eventually, the Renaissance arrives, and society begins to tear those robes off.
Slowly but surely.
And the revolutionary force doing the tearing isn't a new theologian. It's science.
Yes. In a fascinating collection of notes called Dialectics of Nature, Engels explores how early science began to dismantle the rigid worldview of the Middle Ages.
Right.
He praises the giants of the Renaissance. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who were practically engaged in observing the material world, but he notes that early science suffered from a massive blind spot. It was what he calls petrified.
Petrified, like a fossil, meaning it couldn't move.
Exactly. The prevailing scientific consensus of the early modern period was that the universe was completely immutable.
Meaning unchanging.
Right. They believed God created the world in one specific moment, and it had never changed a single inch since. The planets ran in their exact same tracks since day one. Every species of animal was exactly as it was in the Garden of Eden. Mountains didn't move.
It was a static, unmoving snapshot of a universe.
Exactly. But then the scientific breakthroughs of the 18th and 19th centuries happen, and that static snapshot just shatters.
How does Engels trace that?
He highlights a chain reaction of discoveries. First, the philosopher Immanuel Kant proposes the nebular hypothesis.
Which is what, except?
It's the idea that the solar system wasn't just spoken into existence as is, but slowly developed over millions of years from swirling masses of gas.
Oh, so space has a history.
Right. Then came modern geology, proving the Earth itself had a deep history of violently changing strata. Then Darwin proves biological evolution. Then the discovery of the biological cell.
Just one hit after another.
Step by step, science proves that nature is in constant flux. It comes into being, it changes, it passes away.
And by proving the universe has a history of its own, science is slowly stripping away society's mystical veil.
Right.
It demonstrates that the material world changes itself naturally, organically, without needing a divine hand to come down and push the planets around every single day.
Exactly. The material world explains itself. But, and this is great, there is a hilarious, almost tragic contradiction that Engels points out about the scientists of his own era.
Yes, this is my absolute favorite part of the entire deep dive, the Alfred Russel Wallace story. You have to explain how a brilliant scientist falls for a cheap parlor trick.
It's a great story. So Engels observes that English empirical scientists were making incredible observational discoveries, but they fundamentally rejected dialectical thinking.
Dialectical meaning what in this context?
Dialectics is the philosophical method of looking at how things are interconnected, how they contradict each other, and how they constantly change. These scientists hated broad philosophy. They only trusted their immediate, raw, physical senses.
They thought just looking at something made them objective.
Right. But Engels argues it actually made them incredibly gullible.
Because if you only trust exactly what's in front of your eyes, you're an easy mark for a magician.
Precisely. Engels details the case of Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a giant of science. I mean, he was a peer of Charles Darwin, who independently formulated the theory of natural selection.
Certified genius.
A master observer of beetles and birds. Yet, Wallace fell completely down the rabbit hole of the 19th century spiritualism craze.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. He became a devout believer in phrenology, which is the pseudoscience that the bumps on your skull determine your personality, and mesmerism, or hypnotism.
So Wallace would go to these traveling shows where charlatans claim to have hypnotized subjects. And if the mesmerist touched a specific bump on the subject's head, the subject would instantly act out an emotion.
Yes. The charlatan would touch the so-called organ of veneration on the skull, and the hypnotized girl would suddenly drop to her knees and start praying devoutly.
Unbelievable.
And Wallace watched this happen, trusted his raw senses, and declared it was hard scientific proof of the supernatural.
But Engels wasn't buying it.
Not at all. Engels and his friends went to similar shows, immediately recognized the psychological manipulation, and started playing along to test it. They found that if they just quietly suggested things to the hypnotized subject, they could invent completely fake organs on the spot.
I love this. Engels actually writes about inventing the organ of drunkenness in The Great Toe.
Yes, he does.
They literally touched a guy's toe, and the guy immediately started stumbling around, acting drunk. It is the ultimate irony. You tear down the haunted house of the Middle Ages to build a high-tech scientific laboratory, but then the scientists start holding seances in the break room?
It really is funny.
But seriously, why do Marx and Engels think a genius like Wallace got duped by a fake toe organ?
It all goes back to the absolute necessity of a philosophical framework. Raw observation without a theoretical framework to synthesize it leads to absolute credulity.
You have to know how to think about what you're seeing.
Exactly. If you just trust what you see without asking why you are seeing it, without understanding the complex relationship between the material world and human psychology, you can be tricked by a man touching a toe. Science needs a philosophy of how the world changes to actually make sense of its own discoveries.
Wow. So let's just take a breath and recap this massive journey. We started by diagnosing religion, not as a foolish error, but as a painkiller. The opium used to cope with a brutal society.
Right.
We traced how physical dirt and desert irrigation literally shaped the theology of massive empires. We watched the rising middle class invent a Protestant theology to justify their free markets.
The camera obscura.
Exactly. We uncovered the bitter class war hiding inside the religious language of Martin Luther and Thomas Müntzer. And then finally, we watched science dismantle the static illusion of the universe, only to see brilliant empirical scientists trip over their own feet holding seances because they lacked the philosophy to understand their own eyes.
It really is a sweeping, comprehensive analysis of how human beings experience their own history. But before we conclude, we must return to our neutral lens and clarify their ultimate goal.
Yes, the disclaimer again. We're just explaining their theory.
Right. Because for Marx and Engels, the objective of all this analysis is not to violently ban religion. Like we said at the start, they openly mocked radical political groups, like the Blanquists in France, who tried to literally outlaw God by government decree.
Right, because as we established, you can't just mandate a painkiller out of existence while the patient is still bleeding.
Precisely. In their framework, religion would only naturally fade away when society's economic base was fundamentally fixed.
When the root cause is gone.
Right. When the earthly suffering, the alienation, and the exploitation that require the illusion are resolved through a planned, equitable society, the illusion simply won't be needed anymore. The sigh of the oppressed creature stops when the creature is no longer oppressed.
It all comes back to treating the injury, not banning the medicine.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final concept from the text to ponder on your own.
What's the takeaway?
Well, Engels notes that primitive humans originally personified natural forces. They created gods of lightning, gods of the harvest, gods of the sea, and they did that because nature was an alien, uncontrollable power that dominated their fragile lives.
They needed a way to understand and cope with a world that could just wipe them out at any second.
Exactly. The storm was terrifying and unpredictable, so the storm became a god you could bargain with.
Makes total sense.
But look at the modern world. Even if traditional religion fades, modern humans are still dominated by massive forces that feel equally alien and completely out of our control.
But today, they aren't natural forces.
Right. They are social and economic forces. Unpredictable market crashes, sudden massive inflation, systemic banking crises, supply chain collapses. They sweep over our lives and destroy livelihoods like hurricanes.
So we are just as helpless against a sudden global financial collapse as an ancient farmer was against a 3-year drought.
That's the parallel. So the question to walk away with is this. As long as our economic systems feel like unpredictable, dangerous forces of nature, are we destined to keep creating new gods?
Oh, wow.
Will we continuously invent modern superstitions, new ideologies, or fresh illusions to help us cope with a world we feel we cannot control?
Are we still just searching for a new kind of opium for a world that still feels profoundly broken? I mean, when the X-ray is murky, maybe we just draw the lines we desperately want to see. Something to think about. Until next time, keep digging.